Ministério do Turismo, Secretaria Especial da Cultura e Governo do Estado de São Paulo, por meio da Secretaria de Cultura e Economia Criativa, apresentam FLIMA Online 2021. Autora homenageada, Lígia Fagundes Telles.
Olá.
Hello.
Muito boa tarde.
A very good afternoon to everyone.
E bem-vindas e bem-vindos
Welcome to
à mesa que inaugura
the Roundtable
quarto e último dia da FLIMA Online
for the last day of FLIMA Online 2021. FLIMA is a literary festival from Mantiqueira, which this year is honoring Lígia Fagundes Telles. Today, we'll have 3 tables. This first one, which will talk about censorship and self-censorship. Following, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, a table with Bruno Paes Manso, Michel Laub, mediated by Marcella Franco, who will talk about how to portray Brazil in fiction and nonfiction. And closing the day at 7 o'clock at night, the table Amazonia in Flames, which will bring Márcia Kambeba, Torkjell Leira, who will be joining us from with mediation of Cristina Serra to talk about this topic, which is very important, the dispute for the forest. Now, our talk will be about censorship and self-censorship. And to talk about this topic, I have the pleasure of inviting Costica Bradatan. Probably I didn't pronounce it correctly. Costica, a very good afternoon to you.
Thank you.
Costica joins us from Texas. Nice seeing you. And I'll be mediating the introduction in Portuguese, reminding that this table has 3 versions. If you wish to follow the original audio, there's 1 version, which is possibly this one that we're hearing now, I don't know. There's the Portuguese version with translation into Portuguese. These links are also in the comment box on YouTube and in the description of the video. Right? So the table will be mediated in Portuguese, and Costica will speak in English. By the way, Costica, our international guest today, was born in Romania, philosopher, professor, currently living in Texas, where he teaches at the Texas Tech University. He's the editor of over a dozen books. He writes in English and was translated into several languages, German, Italian, Vietnamese, Arabian, and Farsi. Dying for Ideas. His first book published in Brazil was published by Grua at the end of 2020. The philosopher lists several thinkers that faced the most disturbing of choices, being faithful to their ideas and dying, facing a brutal death, or renounce them and stay alive. Costica Bradatan also writes critics and essays for venues such as New York Times and the Washington Post. Once more, Costica, very welcome to FLIMA. I want to say that we're meeting virtually on account of the pandemic. So the launch of his book was postponed, and FLIMA that was going to take place didn't take place. So Costica would be coming here to Mantiqueira in 2020. He is meeting us here on the screen. So to talk to Costica, I have the pleasure of bringing Ricardo Lísias to join us.
Lísias, Ricardo, boa tarde, tudo bem?
Good afternoon, Ricardo. How are you?
Boa tarde, tudo bem.
Você fala com a gente de São Paulo, não é
So
isso?
you're talking to us from São Paulo, right?
Sim, sim.
Yes.
O Lísias é escritor.
Lísias is a writer. He launched in 2020 o Diário da Catástrofe Brasileira.
Foi eleito pela editora
The
Record.
Unimaginable was elected. It's a work in which he analyzes the first year of the current administration. The second volume will be released in the first semester of 2021. Lísias is the author of several authors in several genres, which is a characteristic of his work. Among them, I want to point out Céu dos Suicidas by Alfaguara in 2012, Divorce, which is also by Alfaguara in the following year, to 2013, A Vista Particular from 2016. He has a doctorship from USP, a postdoctorate by Unifest. He created the Família Tobias, which he produces several works in several platforms. And the object book, Inquérito Policial Família Tobias, edited by Lote 42. A very interesting edition, which is exactly the investigation, the farce of the investigation. It's a very special edition. In the play Vou com meu advogado depor sobre o delegado Tobias, Lísias was an actor. He also created Eduardo Cunha, pseudonym, the author of Diary from Jail, with excerpts from a previously unreleased work, which was released in 2017, and he would talk about the problem with this publication. But the justice decided that it couldn't be released, and he would talk about how that happened. Very good afternoon, Lísias. A pleasure having you. And mediating the conversation will be journalist Ricardo Senra. Good afternoon, Ricardo.
E aí, Roberto?
Hello, Roberto. How are you?
Bem, feliz de estar aqui com você.
Happy to be here with you. It's our happiness to have you here. Ricardo's talking to us directly from London, in the south of London, right, Ricardo? Yes, exactly.
Falo com vocês da sala de casa, como
I'm talking to you from my living room, just like everybody else here. Everybody from their window and their home, united with several different time zones, 6-7 hours difference. Texas and London. This is one of the advantages of doing an event on this platform, to connect with people that are physically distant. Ricardo, which I had worked with before, I've been following his career overseas. He graduated from FLIMA, currently working for BBC Brasil in London, and was a correspondent in Washington for BBC Brasil during part of the Trump administration. So this experience will be very relevant for the conversation that we're going to have. I, Roberto Guimarães, the curator of the Say Goodbye Now, wishing everybody a good conversation, inviting everyone to follow the program, and reminding you that this table will be recorded on YouTube. Costica, Ricardo Lísias, Ricardo Senra, good talk.
Obrigado, Roberto. Obrigado a todo mundo que está nos assistindo. É prazer estar aqui com vocês.
A pleasure being here with you. I've been following FLIMA since the beginning, especially this edition with stars, with great names in literature, in super interesting tables. This table, round table number 8, like Roberto said, the topic will be censorship and self-censorship. It will be difficult topics to discuss in a very difficult moment. Two themes that will show a lot on account of the books that we're going to be discussing by this illustrious guest, Ricardo Lísias and Costica Bradatan, starting with dying. As a journalist, I can't help but talking about what's on the newspapers today. Interviews. Yesterday, in Brazil, we have about 25,000 deaths by COVID in Brazil for the second consecutive day in Brazil. Next week, we're probably going to reach 300,000 deaths in Brazil. Brazil is the second country in the world to have the highest number of deaths. Besides death, of course, we're going to be talking about censorship, and censorship, unfortunately, is a present topic in Brazilian scenario. Crivella, mayor of Rio, was talking about books that weren't released in Rio de Janeiro. Other episodes were showing last week. You might remember famous national security. The dictatorship, the end of 83, Jair Bolsonaro, there was a banner with Bolsonaro that said Bolsonaro genocide.
Também, vocês devem ter visto, foi alvo de uma queixa-crime, dessa vez vindo do filho do presidente, Carlos Bolsonaro, também por ter associado a resposta do presidente à pandemia a genocídio no Brasil. Essa lei...
the response to a COVID pandemic was being called a genocide in Brazil.
Em menor proporção e por méritos muito distintos, inclusive contra apoiadores do presidente. Vocês devem se lembrar daquela militante bolsonarista, Sarah Winter, que foi presa no contexto do STF, que é por atos antidemocráticos, aqueles que pediam o fim do STF, a volta do AI-5. Mais recentemente, também na semana passada,
recently last week, a congressman was arrested after showing on a video.
Antes que alguém me acuse de criar falsas equivalências,
before anybody accuses me of falsehood, I'm just enlisting moments where the law associated with censorship is back to the news. But before we start talking with our guests, this concept of censorship has been used in a very elastic and dangerous way.
Que tem como alvo frequente a imprensa e a liberdade dos jornalistas, chama de censura, por exemplo, e associa até a estado de sítio medidas de contenção da pandemia que são usadas em países democráticos no mundo inteiro e que são defendidas pela comunidade científica e também por autoridades como a OMS. Eu estou falando de lockdown, estou falando de...
Talking about lockdown, I'm talking about the use of masks. About this, after this long introduction, I will invite our colleagues to debate. Let me start by welcoming Costica Bradatan and also Ricardo Lísias. I'd like to start the privilege of being here, asking that you introduce your own books that are going to be discussed here at the table.
Grua e o Diário da Cadeia, lançado pela editora Record.
Costica, starting with you, your book talks about death, about the heroism of a few philosophers that opted by death instead of renouncing to their ideas. In your words, about what you wrote, and what does your book talk about that is so interesting?
Obrigado, Ricardo. Bom dia a todos. Thank you so much for your kind and comprehensive introduction. The book I'm talking about, the book which just came out in Brazilian translation with Grua, proposes a look at some moments in the history of thought, some moments of the Western thought more exactly, where philosophers were placed in a situation where they had to choose between, as you said, between staying loyal to their ideas and die, on the one hand, or renouncing their ideas, betraying their ideas to stay alive. It's a tough choice. It's a difficult choice. It's also a rare choice. People usually, if you look broadly, historically at things, usually people do not hesitate. At least today, for example, if you go into a place, a university, pretty much anywhere, very, very few people. a handful of people would make that choice. They would just easily, I can imagine, easily say, well, whatever. I'm going to keep my job. I'm going to keep my life. I'm going to say whatever you like, but I'm going to be around for a while. However, that doesn't invalidate the choice of the others, of the few others who decided to go down instead of staying alive, right? They decided to die for what they thought, to die for what they believed in. The fact that the choice, the issue, the situation is rare, has happened rarely in the history, doesn't mean that it's unimportant. In fact, it is important. It reveals so much whenever it happens. The situation reveals so much about what is philosophy about the condition of the philosopher, about society, his or her environment, about the social pressure, the political pressure that occur. It also reveals something about the power of ideas in the long run. There's something about the power of ideas. I loved your introduction, Ricardo. It raises such an important, so many important issues. But we should be, at the same time, we should be realistic and not deceive ourselves. Philosophers and thinkers and writers have rarely changed history. If you die for your idea, if you decide to get yourself killed and so on, nothing will happen right after. Things happen in the long run. So it's not faced with a regime, with an oppressive regime, the individual writer, the individual philosopher, the individual journalist even, is really powerless. That's why I'm saying we should be realistic. We cannot do much, really. It's because we are insignificant. We are just one. However, and that's where that's where the industry becomes interesting. However, lots of things happen in the mind. Whatever we say, the ideas we stand for, accompanied by the gesture, this existential gesture by our own death, will later on produce some result. It may take a while. We may need a witness. We may need a storyteller, somebody to frame whatever happened into a larger narrative. But in the long run, that story will go into people's minds and will produce something. Again, we may not be able to change the regime right away, but in the long run, the changes can be important. And let me go to one example of philosophers in my book, Jan Patočka. He died in this manner in 1977, right? Nothing much happened after. 1977, he died soon after he was interrogated. Some of the others, including Václav Havel, went to prison. The regime, thrived for a long time. However, his death and the gesture he performed was never forgotten, and somehow it remained in people's minds, and it worked on their minds. And within some 12 years, there was a major political change in Czechoslovakia, which was in part, not exclusively, but in part influenced by what happened with Patočka and the movement of ideas he triggered, and the inspiration that people could find there, and so on. So again, it's complicated. We are not operating here in science with strict causality and so on, cause and effect. It may take a while. Things may be subtle, may be invisible for a while, but they do happen. That's what happens in history, and that's one of the charms, one of the beauties of studying intellectual history and history of thought and so on, because you don't have rigid laws, you do not have causalities, rigid causalities. Things can happen in a very subtle, sometimes invisible way.
Perdão, gente, eu estava no mute aqui, voltei.
Sorry, my button was muted.
Eu agradeci aqui ao Costica
Thank you,
sobre
Costica,
essas palavras interessantes
for your interesting words having to do with his book. We'll go back to this talk about ideas after the lives are gone. But before that, but now let's talk to Ricardo Lísias so he can also introduce the book discussed here at our roundtable number 8, Diary from Jail. Roberto talked in the beginning, but I would like to hear from you what this diary signed with the pen name Eduardo Cunha talks about. What's the purpose? Thank you very much, Ricardo. Before answering your question, I'd like to thank the invitation. I'm following the program. It's very impressive. I'm very happy to be here. I think the homage to Lígia Fagundes Telles is very deserved. I think Lígia Fagundes Telles is someone that Brazil is very proud of. Brazil currently doesn't have much to be proud about, but Lígia is one of the greatest reasons. She's an extraordinary author and deserves all of the celebrations. But to be clear, the audience can hear my voice. I would like to say that I got COVID. I was diagnosed yesterday. I don't feel very bad. I could come here, but I don't feel, I'm not 100%. So I'm here at home, but if something happens, don't be alarmed. My wife is watching, and she'll help me if something happens, but that's it. When we started seeing the politicians going against Dilma and the elections of the current president, I started to feel a certain need to create work that could intervene in an urgent manner, efficient way in our context. I've been very disappointed with the so-called traditional literature. I've been disappointed with the general genres, the purity of the genres, something in that sense, and I decided to create a species of a kind of persona. The former Congressman Eduardo Cunha, former Congressman Eduardo Cunha started to say that he was going to publish a book explaining everything that happened. Everybody loves to publish a book now. Everybody does that. Poet, Eduardo Cunha, and his book is going still to be released. I thought, well, I could write a book about Eduardo Cunha. I could do that. I'd like to write his book. So I decided to write simply his book. What did I do? I researched his life. I deeply researched his life. It wasn't difficult because he was on the internet all the time. There's little jokes that he has. He tweets about everything, any topic. What helped me a lot. It's very interesting. Eduardo Cunha is embroiled with color. It's a long story, but what happened? I didn't see any sense in simply publishing a book in a conventional way. I didn't see the reason. So what I'm going to say now can shock somebody, But I went to the courts. My intention with this book is to mock the former congressman. Of course, I have other intentions. I'd like this mockery to be done through art. But I wanted to laugh at his face. I wanted to mock him. I also... And that was my intention when I decided to use a pen name, Eduardo Cunha. But it needs to be clear, the first question, which is important. I would never deceive the audience. I am isolated with coronavirus, and I don't have the book here, but anyone can see on the cover the pseudonym. The fact that it is a pseudonym, a pen name, is part of that work. That is, I would like also that Eduardo Cunha could be seen because he didn't write that book. It was a defense that was taken by the courts. My attorney went to the courts. A pen name means that the name signing the work can't write the work. Anyone can write. Even Costica Bradatan could have written this book, but not Eduardo Cunha. So, what happened? When my book was going to be released, there was news that Eduardo Cunha went to the courts asking for ridiculous things. He wanted money, naturally. He wanted the book to be prohibited. He wanted me to be arrested. Short of asking me to kneel down in public square and crying on national news. The court of first instance loves to concede what Eduardo Cunha asks, even if it's the most ridiculous things. Brazilian justice, in first instance, prohibited my book, and in my opinion, did something that's ridiculous. The Brazilian justice, the court of first instance, destroyed my work in a moment that it demanded that my name was revealed, because we tried to explain to the judge, but the final sentencing, I felt really ridiculous, because the final sentencing is absurd. I am right now being indicted, and the sentencing is public because I couldn't prove that I am arrested. It's written in the sentencing. So once I am not arrested, I couldn't prove that I am arrested. I couldn't write the book, which is called Diary of Jail, because that deceives the audience. But it's ridiculous, but it's what happened. There was a court decision. We appealed. Justice. We won. And Brazilian courts asked that it was... How can you ask the public to forget that it's me? It doesn't make any sense. I won the appeals, and now the first instance course in the final sentencing, the judge sentenced Eduardo Cunha 30,000 reais, and that the money is collected. The appeal has been filed. It will be tried, and I'm hoping that the book will be released. After that, all I did was to write a second diary, which is this one, Diário da Catástrofe Brasileira, which I talk about the current administration. I'm not going to say the name. So I don't need any further bad luck, so I'm not going to say the name of the current president. So I want to have an evil eye on me. But in short, this is it. We're also going to talk about the second book, What an Imbroglio, with the fights at court. We'll talk about that, but also let's go back to Costica. I was reading your book, preparing for this roundtable. I was thinking about if I was death itself, I would love your book. And I say that because in a way, you displaces death from that traditional idea, the opposite to life. You put it in a different perspective, something you say that death sometimes intensifies life to the point of, in your words, to bring new lives to life. I think that you say, if you were immortal, we would end up dying because for lack of sense, lack of meaning. So from what I understand, death, according to the philosophers that you study, shown in your book, death could bring an urgent meaning. And life is all we want. I want to bring this to the pandemic context that we're living, that I talked about in the beginning. Death was never so close to us. It was never a topic so present in the news, in talking at home, and everywhere. As I said, almost 2,500 people died in Brazil. This discussion about death in your book happens in a specific universe, which is the philosopher's universe, that didn't agree to renounce their ideas to survive. This idea, this perspective of life as the opposite to life, it dialogues with death that we live today in times of pandemic. This concept does not apply to this context.
Right. Thank you, Ricardo. It's a different angle, and it's a different kind of death. It's a different way of dying, obviously. The fact remains, as you pointed out, that death has always been an important part of who we are. And it should be regarded as such. Luckily, over the last several decades, even going back a century, that has been kept hidden somehow, kept secret. Because of the technological progress, because of the medications available and so on. And also because of the shift in the cultural appropriation of death, we haven't witnessed much of what our ancestors used to centuries ago. Before, there are historical studies where you see Felipe Arias, for example, death was, throughout the Middle Ages, for example, into the modern age, death has been a visible, prominent part of life. You could see, funerals around, you could see around you people dying, you could go to a funeral and so on. People would die at home, not at the hospital. They would be taken away from home and so on. Death was much closer. People would, from an early age, would develop a different attitude towards death and dying. But because of a number of things, as I said, over the last several decades, perhaps 1 century, death has been removed, at least in the West, from the scene, from what we normally encounter, right? But that's an optical illusion. That doesn't mean that death has actually gone anywhere. That's really a dangerous optical illusion. In fact, as you just pointed out, death is always around and handy. And what we have here with the pandemic is a very natural death. It's death in a brutal, ugly, terrifying form, which is pretty much what death is about. Death has always been like this. We should never be, deluding ourselves. It just happened that it came after a long period when we are not used to seeing that around. Now that's a natural. Of course, it has been extrapolated. It has been amplified. The tragedy could have been reduced by better governance in Brazil, in the United States, elsewhere. We have to say this. We have admirable, governments, Singapore and Taiwan and many countries, Finland and a number of countries, Australia, where they did a very, very good job at protecting people. But even there, people died, right? So that happens. It's a better governance would cope better with this brutal fact. But the fact remains that we die. We died during the pandemic. We die because of the pandemic, right? In my book, in my history, death takes a different form. Death is something we individually engage with and sometimes even chose. As we talked before, I'm given the freedom, I'm given the choice to stay alive or to die, right? So that's like at least I can postpone. I can, buy some time and die 10 years later if I accept whatever is being asked from me right now. There's a kind of, I would say, even mastery of death in these philosophers' situations. They negotiate with themselves. They persuade themselves that they have to die now. They master, their fear, their anxiety in front of death, and so on and so forth. Whereas if you get the COVID, I mean, of course, it's very fortunately, very few people die, but it's a brutal fact. It's there. We have to be careful. You have to do what you can to stay away and to stay away from the virus and to protect yourself. But broadly speaking, to push the boundaries a bit, that has, because it has always been there, has had this metaphysical, even religious, dimension. It has always shaped the way in which people live their lives, in which they understood the other world, in which they understood themselves. It's always, and pretty much any major religion is in a way about death. Is supposed to help us cope with our finitude, with our mortality. It's supposed to help us die better, be prepared to die better, which is a big deal. I mean, if you know how to die, if you know how to prepare yourself, it's fundamental. And if any religion can do that, it's a good religion. It's a useful religion. And of course, in philosophy, you have a long trend from from Socrates on, a serious, substantial branch of philosophical thought dedicated precisely to preparing for death. You have it in Plato, death as the notion of death as philosophy as preparation for dying. It's better than this you cannot go. I mean, Plato places death, the fact of dying, at the very core of what philosophy is about. And from there you go to, the Stoics and then Seneca, and in the modern times, have Montaigne and Simone Weil and many others. It's fun. It's always there. Again, the topic is not pleasant, especially in our times of oblivion. We prefer not to see death around. We prefer, happy endings in politics, in movies, in stories, in anything. And that, in the long run, that creates some kind of conditioning. And it happened to me here. I tried to teach once a course on death and dying, and it was terrible. The students were not just displeased, but they were terrified because I brought into the classroom something they had never seen before. The kind of texts like the death of Ivan Ilyich and others and the kind of movies like Ikiru and Kurosava's Ikiru and others that they had never been exposed to. They were terrified. A number of them dropped out because they just couldn't take it. From one week to the next, they would be more tired, more scared, And eventually, the group became the group of students became much smaller from than it was at the beginning. That tells you something about the way in which the West today, the West, has come to understand finitude and our finitude, our condition, which is a shame. It's a way of living in untruth. If we decide to ignore death and dying and finitude, it doesn't mean that we'll never die. It only means that we'll die unprepared. We'll die what's called a bad death. It doesn't help anything. It's just it's a self-delusion. It's a very unreflective and unphilosophical attitude, which unfortunately the mass culture only stimulates.
Costica, ainda para você acha que
Costica,
esse número total de mortes que acontecem,
number of deaths that are happening in a very different context than the deaths described in your book, do you think the pandemic will change the way we relate to death, this different happy ending that you describe? In the following years, do you think we're going to have a different relationship to death in the future?
Good question. It will change, but I think it will be only for a short while. We will have a different understanding of what life is, of what death is, of more exactly of how fragile everything is, right? How precarious our lives are, right? And our children perhaps, but later on we'll forget. That's something we'll always learn from history, because we prefer not. Death is a terrible topic in itself. And any biological creature, any biological entity will do anything possible to stay alive, to look forward, to be optimistic, and prefer not to think of death. It's not just because it's not just a matter of culture; it's a matter of self-protection. Now the problem. So it happens all the time. You have. Just go back mentally in time to post-World War II, to Europe. So it was terrible. It was a genocide. It was such a devastation on such a large scale, right? Millions of people died brutally, senselessly, right? And when the war ended, it was, of course, terrible. People had to take that in, had to think about. But within, let's say, 20 years, much of that was forgotten. Much of that. That's why you need these places of remembrance, cemeteries and monuments and occasions to remember the fallen ones, the soldiers, the heroes, and so on. Because if we don't have those visible places, right, the symbols, the sites of memory, and so on, we'll forget even on a more alarming scale. It's in the nature of life itself not to be concerned with death, to look forward, to ignore, because it's undermining. It's undermining. You cannot on a daily basis think of dying, of death and dying. You should do that as critical intellectuals, as public intellectuals, as thinkers, as writers, and so on. We should always keep that. But that's more of a normative thing. Practically speaking, people prefer not to think because the life instinct is much stronger than this instinct or this quest for wisdom, which would would imply more thinking about that.
Obrigado, Costica. Lísias, a gente estava aqui conversando sobre.
We were talking about death. How humanity perceives death. Costica was saying that maybe in time it will have a new meaning, but we're trying to avoid this topic, which is so difficult. But talking about death, you always talk about government in your public speeches and social media. You've been talking about the Brazilian government to the pandemic, talking about all the deaths that we're seeing in Brazil. You talked about your last publication, O Diário da Catástrofe Brasileira, talking about Bolsonaro, there are key moments of this administration. From what I understand, is an ongoing work. The first year has been published, and you're about to release the second year. You've been saying that this will be published here shortly, and also talking about that you hope this book will disappear along with the administration. What can we expect from the next diary that you're about to release? And what is the format of this diary? Do you like this genre? If you can talk about that. Thank you. First, I think Brazil is facing an experience with the pandemic different from the rest of the world. I think that the United States are facing something similar in the beginning, but they managed to overcome the situation. Brazil is going to have a challenge, which is understand how the voters that go to the election next year will face the fact that they have to decide a government that plans the death of their people. The Brazilian government, I followed the current president even during campaigning, and during the campaigning, the president was already saying that he would do something disastrous, destructive. He said that several times. He destroyed a lot of things. He thinks that just destroying, you can't build something. So the pandemic came. The way that the Brazilian government, as far as I can understand, as far as I can research, at this time, it's unique in the world. Even if we have 3 or 4 states somewhere which are dealing with the pandemic in the same way, this is the only government which right now, in the current situation, is still working in favor that their people die on account of the pandemic. It's a challenge, really. We'll have to think about that. Now, what's my opinion? My opinion is, which at the same time is my fear, the one that was the people that were capable of voting for Bolsonaro, it's capable of anything, in my opinion. I think that voting in the current president, for the people that did that, look, you voted for someone that in the face of death of 2,500 people every day, went to social media, I am infected, I don't have shortness of breath, I feel bad a little bit. But it's enough to try to think what these people are going through, the people that are needing oxygen, which we know that the government refused to buy. How these people are dealing with this question? I think that not necessarily something, what was defining, almost 48,000 million people were capable of voting to this thing. He said everything that he said during the campaign. This person, the current president, cannot be accused of deceiving anyone. He said exactly what he was going to do, and he is doing it. He's doing what he said. So I think that we have a type of Brazil. Other nations, as I research, other nations are, Brazil is having a meeting with death. The death of Brazil as a country, it has a set date. So I want to see the voters in face of death will make I'm sorry, I'm thinking slow. The people that will deliver themselves to death in a passionate way. Well, let's say are not the people that Costica talks about in his book, because in his book, he talks about people that had a vocation for life, for death. Here in Brazil, these people are working for death, for the death of others. Overall, the most vulnerable communities. The newspaper published an article yesterday talking about the location of the deaths in the city of São Paulo. The deaths in greater numbers always are in the most vulnerable groups. That was announced in the beginning of the pandemic. It was said that it was going to happen, and this is what's been happening. That's according to the Convention for a Genocide, the definition is when governments calculate deaths of groups, how can I say it, specific groups, and work so that this happens. Brazil right now has a genocide that's being led by the president. And if it's not enough, people don't even manage to have a political attitude, a concrete attitude, so that he doesn't even,
Eu ia falar isso, Lísias. Desculpa te interromper, mas isso justamente
I'm sorry.
Da mesa, né?
The topic of the table. You classified the government as a genocide. This definition, I'd like to talk about the topic that brings us together, this matter of censorship, which now is object of discussion in relation to people that have been calling the president a genocide. It's a matter of national security. This is a government interested in dictatorship full time, but now you said something that I think is admirable, very important, that you said, besides national security, it is used for a series of people, from Felipe Neto up to this despicable person that tore up a sign with the name of Marcella Franco. I think it's important to talk about. It's fundamental. Brazil is a country essentially conservative. Although we have groups that are not conservatives, the institutions, the Brazilian institutions are really, in general, conservative. So what happens? When there's a certain movement, destabilizing movement, the conservatives work fast. And what we have is this movement trying to stop any problem, like a dictatorship law that stops Felipe Neto, or the other one that you mentioned, Sarah, I don't know what's her name. So it's an event that preserves a law that is unconstitutional, that shouldn't, has no meaning.
A gente está preso até agora a esses temas.
We're here talking about these topics, death, censorship, talking it in the context of the pandemic and Brazilian government, but reading your book, Costica, your book was published in 2015 originally, if I'm not mistaken, and now in Portuguese in 2020 in Brazil. So you already made reference, when you talk about death, the collective catharsis that usually happens after great episodes that generate death, great catastrophes, wars or pandemics. If I'm not mistaken, you mentioned the book The Cameron, which turned into a movie. You talk about the pestilence And it reminds me this group in Florence, Italy, talking about how people, after this kind of episode, dramatic episode of death, mass death, they end up being excessive in carnal pleasures, celebration. I'd like to know if you hope that this will happen once the pandemic is controlled, is under control. This catharsis will come back for celebration of life. Will it also happen in 21st century?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Can you hear me all right?
Sim.
Good.
Yeah.
It's a dynamic. It's been before. It happened before, and it's a matter of the dialectics of life. Will come out. It's of course, unfortunately, there'll be many people dead and traumatized and so on. But we'll come up with a stronger thirst for life, with a new or renewed joy of living. That's what happens after even the most disastrous events, wars and plagues. It's in the nature, again, it's in the human nature, it's in the very nature of things. As we lie down now, we struggle with our finitude. We suffer. We suffer a lot of anxiety. It's the anxiety of death, right? We may not make it, right? We may be the victims. We may die, and that would, of course, when we'll survive, many will survive. We'll survive. We'll come out in a way not just stronger or better prepared existentially, but with a renewed thirst for living. And even now you see signs that people are trying to book tickets to travel to. The airline industry is expecting a boom, right? I mean, just when you think of that, it's just we are still in the middle, right? In the dark, we are in the forest, right? We don't have enough vaccines, we don't have solutions, but yet the airline industry is expecting a boom, which is very interesting because they operate with the same notions, with the same conceptual apparatus. It's exactly what I said before. They expect people to come back with a renewed thirst for travel, to enjoy life, to go somewhere, to spend money, to forget, because it has been a terrible, dark and deadening period. Again, it's the same dynamic. It's life and death behave sometimes like they are twins. They are enchained together. It's one. You never know. It's when you are transitioning from one to the other. They come together. They always come. They are always together. And I pretty much expect that a new thirst for life, and it happens after wars, for example. Because they happen more often and they are more documented. We have chronicles and we have historical documents where you see that people become more optimistic, even if after all the tragedy, after all the casualty and so on, suddenly they want to do business, to marry, to have children, to start everything. They haven't been depressed, right, by the terrible events they just had been through.
Finalmente, otimismo nessa mesa. Lísias, você
Optimism
também
at
se
this
prepara
table.
para o
Lígia,
futuro de excessos, festa.
we're preparing for a future of excesses, joy, spending, when this is all under control. I am not sure how we're going to face this in Brazil. I think Brazil will have small moments of epiphany when there's a type of a light at the end of the tunnel, but not Brazil is living in epiphany, which is Lula's speech last week. I don't know how we're going to face the situation here. I think I work. I hope very much that at the end of next year, Brazil will have overcome the greatest mistake that their citizens have made in history, that this mistake is corrected in the following elections. If that happens, there will be tension, because we have a society that at this time seems little organized to fall in love for this suffering. Brazilians who are passionate about the suffering that the president is offering us, it's sickening. I think that now the pulse of death dominates a large number of people. But I still believe that it's possible to next year to correct this mistake. But let's make it clear, Brazil will have, I hope that Brazil will be mature enough. I don't foresee it, but I hope that Brazil will be mature enough to face what it did to itself. Maybe then Brazil will finally get to another historic moment. I'll give examples. Canudos. The 111 killed at the prison and so on. The difference is that these massacres happened in hidden places. Canudos, for instance. It was a massacre that happened in the countryside. When there's the massacre of the 111 detainees, it was in a closed space. I remember that time we didn't have access to the news. It took 3 or 4 weeks until we finally were informed of the level of disgrace that happened. It always happened at night, massacres of populations, and it was hidden. And now Brazil elected someone who made this something open. Politics, open politics. This is something, this is a leap that Brazil has witnessed that's very traumatic. Society cannot face it as if, for instance, Argentina, Bolivia, our neighbors are facing the pandemic. Chile purchased large numbers of vaccines. It's not our case. That is, I think, if we can overcome this, maybe Brazil would also overcome this pest. You ended up answering a question by Natalia. She was asking, how can Brazil be more democratic? What are the possible paths? Lísias ended up answering that in a way. Talking about how we vote and how we should vote. Let's talk about now the literary work, your literary work, which is of interest for people that are following us in the literary festival. Censorship and self-censorship. Something that, in my opinion, unites your work, the work of both of you, are descriptions of you, page turners, as we call it in English. They describe your books as page turners. That is, books that you want to keep reading. You keep turning the page, keep going forward, you don't want to stop reading. This is not a classification. Traditionally, very common. For philosophy books, Costica, in general, you hope that philosophy book is dense, heavy, like a lot of people say, and so not very accessible and tiresome. But what we see in your publications, that's not the case. They're not perceived like that. Is that your concern when you are working, when you're writing and preparing your books, your works? Do you worry about how it's going to be perceived by the audience? Do you try to make it a pleasurable reading? Or is it a consequence of other priorities that you have?
No, obviously, you are on the spot, right on the spot there. It's part of the plan. It's a strategic choice to use certain strategies, certain devices, certain techniques to make the book more enjoyable, more readable, more accessible to the writer. Philosophy has a bad reputation in precisely that respect. You know, it's as if philosophical books are supposed to be disgusting, you know, impenetrable, and as technical as possible. That's a misconception, actually. It's a different story. We can go there, but if you read philosophy from Plato's on, all the way from Plato to Nietzsche, are written in a very accessible manner, in a very pleasant. They are literature. Philosophy, when it's done best, is a form of literature. So it's something you notice, and I'm happy, and other people have noticed that there is a certain narrative fluidity in there. It's something I plan to do. It's something I want to do even more in the next. For example, in the book I just finished, it's a book on In Praise of Failure. It's a book in which I explicitly use narrative techniques. I have characters, I have a plot, I have an epilogue, I have a prologue. It's also, so there's something instrumental about storytelling here, in the sense that, you know, if you employ storytelling devices, you can persuade people, you can attract a large audience. So I'm using storytelling as a device, as a matter of persuasion technique. But it's something broader. I do believe in broader than that. I believe that humans are fundamentally narrative-driven creatures. Whatever we do, whatever we think, whatever we say, there is a narrative in there. If you go somewhere and somebody asks you, you know, how was your day? You start telling a story. We are nothing but the stories we tell ourselves and others. We are the stories we create all the time. It's fundamental. It's just think of anything, a piece of news. I'm not talking, of course, about literature. That's obvious in works of fiction, but even in non-literary situation, in non-literary context, you do have narrative. And one of my ambitions in my philosophy books is to show that philosophy can be done in this narrative way. To even the fact of an argument, you make an argument, right? That's what philosophers do all the time. But if you look more closely, arguments are stories, are plots. You need to always, as you progress, as you make your argument, you bring in certain things first, and then you bring other things, and you have a sense of plot. And at the end of your argument, it's the end of your story. So even the most mainstream academic philosophers today would not be happy to accept that. They would, disregard. They would dismiss such an idea. But the fact remains that they operate. They are storytellers, even they don't know it.
Legal. Lísias, eu te faço a mesma pergunta. Eu pessoalmente, eu conheci o seu trabalho.
I know your work, Divórcio, which I read in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. I read in 2014, and I was working for Folha de São Paulo. You can imagine how it was, the anxiety to read this book, to establish connections. If you don't know, there's a diary element. It tells the story of a guy named Ricardo also, who was at a wedding, and then all of a sudden he gets his wife's diary and finds a series of comments that are very difficult, negative, made by her in relation to her husband. And more than that, she also tells about experiences, sexual experiences and others with other people. And this guy gets crazy and starts going to the street and running. And then he runs a marathon. And just like Costica's book, that story gets you. And you want to know what this woman wrote about the guy and how the guy is going to react to all of that. There's more than that. The guy's name is Ricardo, and it matches the biography in a little. How was the construction of this book with this perspective of grabbing the reader and drawing the attention of people to get in touch with your work? Excellent question, thank you. And the question, I like the way you asked it, because in general, when people talk about my book, something you didn't mention, people say that my work confounds reality with fiction, and that's not true. In my opinion, fiction is part of reality. Fiction, the book, the text, the fiction text, is in our world. How do I work? With this question, without a doubt, doing mediation with the people that's going to place into their reality my work. So that doesn't mean that I try to, for instance, to seduce my reader. If we're talking about the reader in a broader sense, as an entity, we know the author is dead. He died in the 60s. I think that the reader is also dead. I think that the reader is not immune to what happened in the story. I try to produce work that seek to expose, but I think what's most interesting, the one that's exposed is the reader. There are other people that hate me and think that I have a bad character. So, what do these people do? They announce to everyone, these people that hate me because of this novel, they say that this novel is not fiction. They say that, and then they say that because I wrote, they say that that's unethical. So it creates this situation that, to me, is nonsense. I like that novel very much, Divórcio. I could realize this aesthetic project, and I'm always interested in the reactions of people. Oh, you were taken to courts at time, were you not? No. No, that was hearsay. I wasn't. But the novel Divórcio, I have stories about it. I walked on the street and people gave me hugs and said, "Wow, you put me in your book. It's me. I loved it."
Quem fez isso uma vez foi como ele chama? Trabalha na Piauí agora, eu não vou conseguir.
I can't remember the name of the person, but people do that. What I would like to say, it's interesting. In my work, when I write, I'm not Padilha. I'm not a coward. When the name of people in my work are the people that we see in the street. I write their names, and you can look it up. I wrote Eduardo Cunha and all of the other Eduardos. When, for instance, my character, Pereira, I write Pereira. I don't. So what happens? The novel is specific. There are people that start reading it and go to the internet trying to study and research what happened. And that has to do with their personality, not mine. That's evident. It's something that all people...
Derrida já deu conta de toda essa questão da assinatura de uma obra, do nome, o nome que assina a obra faz parte da obra.
The pen name is part of the work, and so I don't work trying to seduce the reader. I think that this behavior, artistically speaking, I'm in a society, Brazilian society. I am a Brazilian author. I don't like Brazilian society. I don't have a good relationship with the Brazilian society. And so that's why I'm not shocked that some people love the book and some hate me. They hate my book, they don't hate me. I think that's very interesting. It's the story of a characters. All of a sudden, somebody pulls their hair. It's like it happens to me. Some people call me bad names. In the Ibirapuera Park, you son of a bitch, you wrote this novel. And then I said, well, it worked. It worked because, in my opinion, an artistic work is not the one. If I want to write a work with the intention to dive into reality, reality should. I'll be very upset if people, it would say, look, congratulations, and call me a great writer. I think that's terrible. Trying to control my work and giving explanations. They're trying to place me in a museum. And I cannot allow something like that. I'm feeling a little better. I think I'm getting healed. I think I'm getting rid of Corona. COVID. I'm feeling well. I like this conversation about literature and the act of writing. I'd like to keep talking about this. Costica's book, in the beginning, the initial considerations in the opening of the book, you say, apologize, I had access to the book in English, so this is a translation that's worse than the translation that's available in the market.
Deixa eu ver aqui. Livros podem pedir solidão em sua concepção e gestação, mas eles nunca são solitários por natureza. De fato, no sentido importante, eles são só uma maneira diferente de se estar com os outros. Mais ainda é escrevê-los. Escrever livros é aprender com os outros.
Writing books is learning with others, talk to them, receive their support, and be indebted. I'd like to know more about this process, this dialogue, this different dialogue that you propose for your books, Costica. How is the creation, from the creation to publication, what's the system? How is the flow, this great flow of ideas and research so ample that you did about these 5 philosophers? How does that transform in that organized chapters and stories that are getting deeper and deeper?
Well, it's complex. I'm glad you brought that up. I came from a place, Romania, where authors could be very proud, and they would just, write everything down, and then at the end put the signature and send the book to the press. And the book would be their exclusive, product. And actually, before I left Romania, I wrote 2 books, pretty much in that manner, and that was a mistake. I even if I'm not a very social person, in general, whenever it comes to writing books and so on, I really need others. So I got involved. I involved a number of people when I was writing that book and any other book out. And
Eu acho que o Costica travou. Não sei se para vocês também.
I don't know if you can see him. Yeah, it's muted. Oh, he is back. He is back.
Yeah. There's a collapse in the connection. When I finished the book, I sent it out to a number of people, friends, editors, and I really asked them to criticize me as much as they can, as to be as critical as they could possibly be. And I incorporated all that feedback, and it became the book you read. But there is something else. Before, the book was initially just a text. The connection is not very good. So I wrote just an initial essay, and then that was a kind of experiment. It was published, it came out, it was a number of people made comments, sent me feedback, and then actually that persuaded me to turn that essay into a book. And
a conexão do Costica tá soluçando um pouco. Eu acho que...
Yeah, Costica's connection is
not. Acho que a gente perdeu ele de novo. Lísias, você tá comigo ainda?
Eu tô perfeitamente. A minha conexão
Lísias, are you here?
Brasileira.
Yes, Liz. Yes.
I'm sorry. The connection is bad.
No worries.
It's unstable. Okay, I hope it works now.
Sim, eu te ouço bem.
Okay, good. The book changed. The project changed a lot throughout the process. I had to write stuff that was left out later on. I added things like fundamental, turning points in the narrative at the very end, right before sending it to the press. So it was a project that was alive and changing and shifting and changing its shape all the time, all the way from the beginning to the end. And of course, the question that you may ask yourself is it actually finished now? Well, it's printed. It's printed. That's it. It's dead, in a sense. It's no longer capable of changing its shape, except in translations, in people's minds, in the way in which people respond to it, and so on. But it's again, it may be helpful to some people. I'm not familiar with the cultural situation in Brazil, how books are being produced and made and so on. So for me, it was a big deal, a major learning experience to shift from Romania, where authors are supposed to be the only, the exclusive authors of their work, and the Western cultures in England and yes, where you really involve other people. You ask people for feedback. You incorporate that feedback. You collaborate. Of course, you sign your book. You have your name on the cover, but you do involve a number of people. I think that's very good. Personally, other people may be better author than me. They may not need outside help. The fact that I changed languages and I adopted English later in life has something to do with that, because I'm not totally confident in my English. So I really need people to, native speakers of English to get involved and help me with their reading. So I hope I answer your question. I apologize for the technical issue.
Não, você respondeu super. E eu rebateria a pergunta, porque isso me lembrou...
That reminded me of the process, the active process that you described of dialogue during the production of the book.
Esse clima de verbo, de ação.
This verb and action that the production of the book demands. It reminded me the way you refer to philosophy in your book. According to how you describe it, it's not a group of ideas inside of a publication to be debated among intellectuals and philosophers. You talk about philosophy as action, verb. You talk about the philosopher acts philosophy in their day by day. You talk about philosophy as a performance. I would like to understand a little more about this interesting concept.
Right. That's a good question, and I'm glad you brought it up. So there is in the West right now, and pretty much in the rest of the world, this notion that philosophy is written, is encapsulated in academic texts. It's something to be taught, to be in schools, to be lectured, to be written about, to be commented on, and so on. But that's that's an illusion. That's an optical illusion having much to do with our particular position in time, in history. For a very long time, for centuries on end, philosophy was an oral, practical, vivid experience. People would Socrates and Plato and later, not to mention the Asian philosophers, the Buddhists and so on. Philosophy was performance. People would chat, would get together, would chat with each other, would discover something, and would agree or not or disagree on something, right? And that's very important. Then will try to behave, to lead their lives according to what they had discovered. You have that when you read Plato's, for example, you have very, very powerful in Socrates' behavior and Socrates' performance. Philosophy is performance in the sense that it involves speech and conversation and dialogue, but in the first stage, and that it is performance because it involves embodiment. Philosophy needs to be, you have to put your body on the line. You have to make certain changes in your life. You cannot, as a philosopher, you cannot say one thing and do something else. Your word is your bond. Your word is maybe not your word, your ideas, your thinking is that which shapes your life, that which shapes your behavior. So you have, and that's something that was fortunate, it was discovered or rediscovered or re-theorized in the 80s by a French philosopher, but first of all, it was Pierre Hadot, a French philosopher, very interesting guy. He was a student of ancient philosophy, and that's how he retrieved, the original sense of the manner in which the ancients practiced their philosophy. And then Michel Foucault, who was friends with Hadot, and they knew each other very well, kind of popularized the notion, and it made it into a global phenomenon. So it's catching up today. This notion of philosophy as a way of life, philosophy as performance, is becoming more and more influential. But of course, what's ironical about it, and it's even my case, philosophy as an art of living, right? Philosophy as embodiment, philosophy as a style as a lifestyle, is becoming the object of academic discourse, which is it's undermining, because if you do believe that philosophy is an act of life, is a form of life, you have to do it. What's the point of academic commentary? Why would you? I would say it's a matter of it's a colonization. Academic philosophers, mainstream philosophers of the other school try to monopolize, to take control over the other philosophy of the one that practices philosophy, that sees philosophy as a way of life. But anyway, the fact remains that it's becoming popular. If you just look Google philosophy as an art of living, as a way of life, there'll be plenty of stuff. Especially there'll be references to Stoicism, references to Pierre Hadot, references to Schopenhauer, to Montaigne, for example, which is good. There is a trap. There is a potential danger there because you can this way you can easily popularize. You can turn philosophy into self-help industry, self-help stuff, right? It's so easy. Anybody can do it. You don't have to worry. So that's the risk, because it becomes, if it's everywhere, it's nowhere. If it's everything, it's nothing. But still, I do hope that there will be a serious. It will remain philosophy as an art, as performance. Philosophy as an art of living will remain a serious concern, a form of engagement, of meaningful engagement in the intellectual life.
É muito interessante. Quando você falava, eu lembrei do Paul Preciado, que é um filósofo que fala bastante sobre performance e da própria existência. Ele descreve muitas vezes nessa linha. Eu queria voltar para o
I'd like to go back to Lísias.
Tem uma pergunta aqui para você.
There's a question for you.
Wallace
Granja is asking,
o uso da Lei de Segurança Nacional em caso
the use of national security in high visibility cases, can it be interpreted as censorship? Examples to mine the critics, is there a threat? What do you think? Something is clear. Censorship is the use of a force that can be legal so that a message is not released. And my book, Diário da Cadeia, was censored for a few days for legal determination, unconstitutional, which kept the book from circulating. What happens with national safety law? Many times, sometimes censorship, when there's this obligation by force of the law that something is removed, explaining that the current president commits genocide when these banners are removed and people are arrested. It's not just censorship, it's also a threat because it tries to contain a discourse by use of force. Arnaldo Jabor, for instance, called the president something in Camulhão. It's the devil. I don't know how they're going to translate that. So it's something very unpleasant. What, in my opinion, what's the greatest problem with the process? When it's put against a work of it has the power of destroying this work because it's a unique fact. So, for instance, using this one that I know, which is my book, the pen name, it has a concept. It's the concept of the pen name. The pen name there is decisive. So when the judge from the court of first instance mutilates my work, artistic works shouldn't be, their content shouldn't be target of judicial analysis, because all judicial analysis, when it disrespects the work, it is at least reductive. You can, for instance, prohibit a performance, and then this performance is released again by the courts, which is something that really happens, that always happens. Performance is released, so that will be a second performance. It's not the same work. it is the performant is somebody that has already been censored, and so it's going to perform differently. People will be seeing a work that also has its discourse changed in that montage, and the previous montage and the current one. It's a repression and censorship. This censorship exists in Brazil forever, but it's gotten worse in the last few years because the artistic work, the good artistic work, is provocative, destabilizing, and now conservatives have great power. Now the work, they want to bar the existence of this work because the work reveals them. And so I think that censorship, when that happens, there's always an attempt to intimidate in general, an attempt to stop the work, but they're not gonna do it. We have 5 minutes. I'd like to mediate. I'll give 2 minutes for each one to. Initially, I would ask for final considerations, but if you allow me, I'd like to ask that each one of you in 2 minutes talk a little bit about what they're reading, and if they could refer good authors for people that are watching us, beginning with Costica.
Oh, well, that's a good question. I'm reading, unfortunately, I'm reading something I have to. I'm reviewing some books for. So as it happens, I'm reading a book by a Romanian author. I'm supposed to review it for the Times Literary Supplement. Cărtărescu, and Mircea Cărtărescu. He's a famous Romanian writer. He may have been translated into Brazilian. But also, I'm pairing up that review with a review of a very fine Italian novel by an Italian novelist, Andrea Bajani. In English is If You Kept a Record of Sins. It's a lovely book, and it's set in Romania. That's why the pairing. That's why you have the editor, the TLS editor, asked me to review them together. So that's what I'm reading right now. But there is more. I'm reading a lot of cynics. Mostly about cynics because they didn't really write. Because that's my next book. I'm trying to understand what's going on in the university life, in the intellectual life, in terms of cynicism, in terms of the cynic philosophy. As if, imagine what Diogenes the cynic would say and do and think about the world in which we live. So that's pretty much, I'm trying to come up with a critique of today's academic and intellectual world from the point of view of cynicism, of the real cynicism. Real cynicism, the ancient cynicism, meant that you didn't care about the public opinion, about the common established views. You just are being yourself, you are genuine, you are authentic, and so on. In today's world, cynicism is what Ricardo has been talking about. It's you have no scruples, no morals. You just don't care. You do whatever you like. It's corruption. It's disgrace. Right? What else? I'm reading a lot of literature. You may find it surprising. Of course, I have to read philosophy because that's my job. But I read as much fiction as possible because that's how I find that not just inspiring, but it's a kind of it's food. It's vital nourishment. I need to read fiction in order to be a better philosopher. It's something you asked me before. How do I operate as a writer? I take a lot from literature. So I'm reading novels and I'm rereading, for example, Thomas Mann, which maybe I'm reading a good reading right now, The Magic Mountain. Okay. But I need to think about. It's a long list. It's again all kinds of things: literature and philosophy and art history and history. I read all kinds of things all the time, depending on what I'm supposed to do at that given moment.
Legal. Tem várias referências interessantes. Lísias,
Lísias,
2 minutinhos para você.
2 minutes for you to tell me what you're reading and to suggest good authors.
Tá bom, eu realmente só tenho mesmo 2 minutos de bateria.
I really only have 2 minutes.
Então eu vou ser bem rápido, mas
I'm going to be quick, but before, I'd like to say thank you again to you, to Costica. We had a great afternoon. I didn't feel well, but now I feel really well. What I'm reading is, the order of reading is Costica, which I finished.
Thank you.
After that, what I liked very much, right now, I'm reading again. I teach about Proust.
Essa é a obra que eu estou terminando justamente de ler agora.
That's the work that I am finishing right now. Let's talk to Roberto Guimarães before we say goodbye, if you allow me. I want to read a poem very quickly by Ferreira Goulart. He talks about life and death and about what remains after death. And it's a poem about the death of Che Guevara. At the end of the poem, he says, life changes the color of fruits forever. It changes like flower rapidly. It changes dream and electric power. But when it's time, and it's time all the time, but a century is not enough. Life changes. Life changes the dead in a multitude. Thank you very much for your presence, and Roberto is with you. Very good to follow this conversation with several layers. It's just sad that a few questions were not able to be asked. This is good, but that made the conversation more interesting. I'd love to listen to Goulart at the end. Ricardo, thank you very much for mediating this conversation from London. Thank you, Ricardo Lísias, here in São Paulo. Partially better, I hope. I hope we can all be healed by the good winds of tolerance in literature and art. Thank you very much, Costica Bradatan, who talked to us from Texas, where he lives. We're going to go on with FLIMA today at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, with a table you can't miss, with Bruno Paes Manso, Michel Laub, Retratos do Brasil, aproximações entre realidade e ficção. And I invite you to stay with us and follow FLIMA on the social media if you can, subscribe to the YouTube channel, because we'll always have news. Once again, thank you very much for being here and by watching us. Big hugs. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Costica, Ricardo. Thank you. Thank you very much. My battery is low. Thank you very much.